I'm so glad not to have to deal with snow anymore.
Yeah.
I grew up in upstate New York
I was born in Glens Falls.
and once lived in Quebec, Canada for a year or two. So
Mm,
I've had my lifetime full of snow.
yes. Yes. Well, and that's the thing, being northern Minnesotans, we're really sort of proud of our, sort of boastful of our, we're northerners, we can deal with it. And we don't, oftentimes we don't even remember that there's a whole nation to our north that that has, what we're experiencing is the minimal that they are. So,
Right.
yeah, so it's a different, yeah, it kind of gives you a different perspective. I actually have to drive up to International Falls on Tuesday to visit the community college up there that we're trying to do transfer agreements with. And that's, I think I have the T-shirt from there of all the cold temperatures, the ice box of the North kind of thing, with all of the record colds for North America, for the North American United States. The people just across the
So,
river are probably.
so that's a bit like the in-car snaps we have here. Is the first one to snap a 40-degree plus or a 50-degree plus
Yeah.
when they've got their cars out. Um, Oddly enough, UK-wise, of course, we don't really get that much snow. Thank you very much for the Gulf Stream. Um, but my first year of living away from home, we had a couple of inches on the Sunday before we all went back one Christmas New Year period. And we went for a walk while dinner was cooking. Sunday lunch was cooking. And it started to snow, which was fine. And we were living about as high up as you could get in southern UK on the south end of the Cotswold Hills.
Mm-hmm.
And as we were walking down this hill, we sort of suddenly realised we couldn't see anything except snow. We were like being inside a ping pong ball, which was somewhat of a unique experience for me and the person I was with. So we decided we better walk home just in case we got stuck. So we sort of turned around and made our way back, which we did. And then after dinner and several hours with the TV for Christmas and New Year's type TV, we thought we'd better see what the snow was like outside. So we opened the back door, couldn't see on the horizon. So I realised that it was snow that I was looking at right in front of my nose. So I patted it all the way up to the top of the door and thought, oh, okay, I wonder how tall this really gets. Went upstairs, put my hand out the window, and it was waist high outside the first floor window, which made it about 8 feet. We were in a bit of a wind pocket, so it wasn't 8 feet everywhere.
Right.
It took 3 days for the snowplow to come past.
Wow.
And we were driving at that point an original type design small Lydian. So it took another 3 days for the snowplow to level the snow out sufficient that the Mini would drive over it without getting stuck on the humps.
Uh-huh.
So we were literally down to our last of the baked beans when we finally got to a supermarket, which was one loaf, one bag of salt, one bag of sugar, and one bag of milk, one bottle of milk, and anything else that was left, which wasn't much because they hadn't had a delivery for a week.
Yep.
So there was no fresh fruit, no fresh greens. Great fun. But the next day was fun.
That's a lot of drifting.
We were recording at our local weather station, which was an old RAF airfield, at minus 26 centigrade, which was joyous.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of it, ambient, I think that's still close to equal the coldest, although I was in Finland one January and swimming in the Bay of Helsinki as well, so not quite sure about whether it's cold or not. And at the moment I'm got a plus 54 as a natural outdoor in the shade range.
Wow.
So pretty good going, really.
Yeah.
Yes. Not a recommended temperature for sunbathing.
Yeah. So this week, I think we're talking about the Confederate monuments, the Southern strategy, and the white backlash. So all kind of organized around that theme of the lost cause and the and I had some I had some interesting. I made some notes while I was reading this week, and I thought it was kind of an interesting set of topics. But what I guess we should probably start with the lost cause in the Confederate Monument chapter. What do we? I mean, we've talked about this before. I thought it was kind of interesting the way this author Karen Cox kind of described it, and clearly, all as a lot of the other chapters that we've read, this is sort of responding to our present moment, kind of as much as it is to this history. So, so what do people think of this?
I just heard about a friend who grew up in Tennessee. I assume she's like in her 50s. She was actually taught that the South won the war. And this is long before Richardson's How the South Won the War book came out, decades before. But that's way beyond lost cause, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how did they explain to her that there wasn't still slavery, or was the war never about slavery, and they won it?
Yeah, it was never about slavery.
Yeah, states' rights. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting in that first, even on the first page of this, that this The Lost Cause, A New Southern History of the War of the Confederates, was actually published in 1866, which I wasn't aware of. That I think I'll probably use when I talk about this in my US 2 class, because I think that's really kind of interesting that this is already, that the revision is, the ink isn't cold on the surrender, and the revisionism has already begun.
Well, it also wasn't that long before somebody was putting up a statue to John Wilkes Booth, which I had never heard, and that kind of shocked me.
Yeah.
And I'll preface all this with the fact that I grew up in a town where John C. Calhoun had a gold mine. And I think that was one of the motivating reasons for let's get the Indians out.
Sure.
And then after moving to the north to lose my accent, I moved back to the south to a town named after John C. Calhoun that also happened to be the capital of the Cherokee Nation at the time. And for spring break in a few days, I am heading to the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee, where my parents live, and flying through Nashville, and hoping to get some good business done there for a minute while I go through Nashville. But it was like, I think to me too, the one I loved the most, I think, was the history, and I think it was a really interesting history, kind of broad history written of the switch of the two parties and how that occurred, or at least the switch in terms of the philosophy with respect to kind of racism and slavery and that piece. I would be kind of curious to see a little more about how other specific philosophies within those although that seems to be one of the big shifts. And I know all too many people who actually watch PragerU. So that was a really great way to open that chapter. Although I think in some of these, it would be more interesting to have a little more evidence of why these things need to be called out as myths. In that case, there was one really good, here's a thing that's been watched millions of times. But I don't always feel like these chapters open up with enough of why this myth needs to be dispelled, although, or at least for future generations, it may not. Right. Historians are going to go back and rebuild that case because it's apparent to us now reading it and watching it that it doesn't need a case, but some of the reasons for the case, I think, would be helpful for the book club 100 years hence who's reading a book that's talking about this.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's and I think that it's easy kind of to see some of the kind of egregious stuff here, and I think that that one is a little bit, the PragerU one, and PragerU sort of videos in general, and and editorials from Fee and stuff like that, kind of seem, or the Mises Institute or that sort of thing, kind of seem to me to be easy to to kind of debunk. One of the things that I think might pass under the radar and not be recognized by future generations is this thing that I've just put in the chat. Niall Ferguson and Lex Friedman and a bunch of sort of people who are portraying themselves as anti-woke are starting this this university in Austin, right? Which is, I think, I haven't really researched it, to maybe the extreme that I should, but the sense that I have gotten just from listening to, Niall Ferguson and Lex Friedman talk on his podcast about it, it strikes me as kind of problematic, and something that might, that might sneak under the radar and not be recognized for I think what it actually might be.
Yeah, I suppose I ought to apologise for the export of Noel. This triple set of chapters is, I suppose, so far out of this book, particularly interesting to me in some respects because overall I know nothing, relatively speaking, or more importantly, I have no real UK equivalent. But it sort of dawned on me in some respects that the closest we'd get, I suppose, is to the flip-flopping around with sort of like Whigs, Tories and Liberal back in sort of the Napoleonic period, I suppose. But, of course, there's a slight co-joining up.
Well, there was a kind of a Tory democracy movement in the 1880s as well, or a movement that called itself Tory democracy.
Well, yeah, but I was thinking
Randolph Churchill.
Much more recently, of course, is we're going through quite a chunk of ex-colonial type thing, which is also predominantly related in terms of initial slavery, even though we banned it earlier than you did. And therefore, subsequently, particularly people who made their money out of sort of African imperialism or just general slave trade, they've been dumped, literally in some cases, that have been put in the docks at Bristol, for instance. There's a guy called Colston, who as I said before, my office wasn't far away. I didn't know what he did. I just knew he was obviously somebody from back then. I didn't even know what the dates were.
Mhm.
So there's a Colston Hall, there's a Colston Road, and there's the area of just up from the town hall of Bristol is called Colston as a district. He turns out to be a slave trader. Much of his boat shipping work was based on moving bodies packed in like sardines, etc., etc.
Mm.
So they eventually they dumped his, like last year, the year before, literally the last couple of years, they dumped him in the harbour. And then those people that got caught for dumping in the harbour actually, I think, got off reasonably lightly, somewhat surprisingly. But the only other time that, as I say, it might have been similar is in the our restoration of the monarchy. But there are still areas you can go where the Puritan type attitude or the Puritan type politics is still relatively at the forefront.
Mm.
But we clearly don't have anything quite like the numbers or the severity. And like we've already mentioned, I quite like the PragerU thing, because occasionally when I'm feeling like I need some reinstatement of why this sort of thing is important, go dip over there to drop myself in their crap, just to remind myself the importance of the argument, etc., etc. But it was illuminating quite a lot. I mean, the one that starts the second chapter of this triple with the PragerU, the thing that got me was the sheer number of quotation or stroke references.
Mhm.
Of all the individual chapter, I think this is what got like more than 3 or 4 times any other chapter so far. They get up to best part of 100 plus. What was it? Yeah, 154 in just that one chapter, which is not that long. And there's, there are pages where there's 1 or 2, but there are pages where there's close on 10.
Yeah.
Pages being different because I've only got a digital book, but
Right.
And
yeah, and this was Kevin Cruz himself.
It's clearly a big thing, and the repetition of some of this into stolen elections and I'm being targeted, and what about her emails, and what about young Biden's laptop, all seem to coming back basically the same playbook virtually.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Yeah, I think it's very well documented. I'm just kind of looking at all of the, since you pointed it out, I'm looking at all of these. He does a good job sort of with his kind of supporting facts, and one of the things that interested me was how early a lot of these people kind of get involved in these in these things. So this is really, I mean, we always kind of talk about people like Lyndon Johnson, coming up, during, coming into politics, being in Washington actually before Franklin Roosevelt gets there, right? Because he's a congressional page, when he's a young man. So he's already, kind of part of this political machine. And really is a generation, I mean, it's interesting. It's kind of strange that he's, that he's John Kennedy's, he's not that much older. He's 9 years older than Kennedy. But as the vice president, as the junior partner in that thing, he's much older. He's a generation older in terms of his political experience. So that's, so that's interesting. And and that Hubert Humphrey is is already getting involved in the in these and saying things that are quotable in the in the 1940s, especially in the 48 election cycle. Then when it gets to and that and that Strom Thurmond is a 1948 presidential nominee. Holy shit.
The guy was old. I mean, it was at least
ancient.
when I knew him.
Yeah. I mean, he hung on for a long time. Well, and it was kind of funny too, because they're as they're sort of talking about this turnover, why don't the Democrats who are in power especially in the the congressional Democrats, why don't they switch? Well, they don't want to give up their committee chairs and their seniority, right? And and then that whole idea that at the end of the chapter that people are that senators are sort of handing the reins on to their sort of trusted lieutenants who are switching parties and becoming Republicans with the endorsement of these these Dixiecrat senators and kind of taking the mantle. And there's this generational change. Actually, the thing that it really impressed on me was how entrenched our House of Lords really is. And and how it isn't, how people stay in there for a lifetime, and and that it really has to be a generational change as these people, they don't die out, in some type of a metaphorical political way. They actually have to die in order for the generations to change.
Which makes me wonder how we shift from here and where do we shift to over the next 100 years, particularly in reading these sections and one or two of the earlier ones where there were kind of small third-party runs that we've talked about, Ross Perot a little, or Eugene Debs getting a reasonable chunk of
as did George Wallace. He got a respectable, as a third party candidate, he got a respectable percentage.
Will we see somebody, if Trump should fall out, the far right is going to need somebody to run, to save the lost cause, if nothing else.
Yeah.
And what does that do to the rest of the logical centerpiece of the Republican Party, the never Trumpers? Where do they go, and how do they go?
Right. Yeah. I think it's interesting. Some of the things along the way too. Another thing that struck me was that Watergate saved the Democrats bacon. Really. I mean, had the way this narrative kind of portrays it, had Watergate not scared these Dixiecrats away from the Republican Party, there might have been, this shift of dozens of prominent, conservative Democrats into the Republican Party, which would have had, that would have had this major significance historically.
He didn't touch on it either, but it was kind of interesting to see the section. There was a little piece where he was talking about the makeup of the Supreme Court vis-a-vis the Brown decision and what that meant to both sides as this shift was happening.
Right.
And it was, and roughly, I think at about that time is when the Federalist Society essentially springs up and turns into a thing in the mid to late 70s.
Right. Right. But the defense against that
if we want to get something, if we want to get something done, we can't just focus on, so it's the presidency shifts first, the House and the Senate shift second, the states shift last. And there's a long 20, 30, 40 year shift that pushes the judiciary,
right,
which is an interesting kind of change, because one might think it's easier to change or shift a local populace other than the branding of the name. Are you pulling the lever for this thing or that thing?
Mm-hmm.
But when you're pulling a lever for ostensibly, in most of at least the Deep South's case, one topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Although I wonder too, I mean, there is an assumption kind of built in there that people are Democrats or Republicans at every level, right? That it's kind of scale invariant, that your local politics and your national politics, will fall along the same party lines. And Thomas Frank sort of suggested, I think, in one of his recent books that he seemed to be finding evidence that contradicted that, and other people have said similarly, right, that that people can be that what people do in national elections, especially presidential elections, doesn't necessarily reflect what they do on a local level. So that would have been a more, he would have had to have probably dug a little bit deeper to find whether there was consistency, or if not, what what explained that.
Well, given the topic in this particular section, and that this particular chapter sandwiched in between two others that make kind of institutional racism the primary topic, we're also a little biased in that it seems like everyone here is made to be a single issue voter on segregation or not segregation, when there are hundreds of other things going on and on the ballots for these types of things. And I think there was at least some idea of melding some brand of conservatism with a little bit of this segregationist thing that the shifting Republican, or the shifting Democrats to Republicans, did. But there could have been more on that particular topic. But the other thing I find interesting too, I don't have a physical copy of this book, but thus far, the chapter that Cruz wrote on that shift seems to be one of the longest of the entire book.
That's the impression I got too.
In a book which he's edited, and I'm curious now to go look up his co-editor and see if he gets a few more pages as well.
Right.
But when it's your book as an editor and you're the kind of lead historian on it, your chapter ought to be like kind of the best story and the best supported. And it's incredibly well laid out, at least for this particular topic, without going further astream. Yeah. Whereas everyone else is writing almost half, I think, based on the just length numbers I've seen on my Kindle.
Yeah.
If they're shorter essays, they don't go into the heavy depth that he's going.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree. I think he did a good job. I was kind of curious. I knew that there was going to be one in here by him, and I was kind of waiting to see if I liked it or not. And I guess I didn't like his introduction, but I did like this chapter. One of the things that kind of jumped out at me that I was a bit surprised about was the Eisenhower's reaction to the Brown decision, and that was that's a side of Eisenhower that I don't normally see or interact with, and that transition from I guess it doesn't surprise me all that much. I had sort of made excuses for him in terms of being not maybe not as much of a career politician, and making some problematic choices in the people that he surrounded himself with, in the State Department and the Dulles brothers, basically, at State and the CIA. But maybe that actually is, maybe I should dig a little bit deeper into my understanding of who he was.
For me, there were a couple of those stories along the way that I look at things in part because of my age in current politics, or at least from the point I became a more political animal in my teens
Mm-hmm.
and more aware of pieces of history, at least. I go back and I look at and perceive Nixon even as a much more kind of dyed in the wool racist than he may have been. And apparently early on, he wasn't quite as much, or I think there was a section 2 on Johnson
Mm-hmm.
being, more pro-segregationist early in the first 20 years of his career. And then suddenly he shifts and is, he's the one that pushes through the civil rights piece.
Right. And yeah, and
But
I was, go ahead. Sorry.
But those pieces were interesting to me, that chunks of this stuff apparently were more complicated for these people, or they shifted their positions over time, or even, maybe some of it is, Nixon not wanting to scare away kind of the middle class white voters who really, because they're in a charmed world, don't think one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
So he doesn't want to say, yes, I'm a pro-segregationist, and lump himself in with, I'll use the phrase, those people. So we can regain the term. And uses that as his Southern strategy, which is kind of, hides the fact that it's a racist construction and kind of allows them to move on, and even more so lets Reagan do it after him in a much more sophisticated way.
Mm-hmm.
The issue now is, as a country, and seeing bits of history like this happen, or Trump, who takes it to its logical conclusion and becomes, an overt racist, what does the rest of the country then do, and how do they react in the next couple of election cycles? I think the framing I've seen, or that I saw coming out of the reportage of Trump's loss, is people are tired of the rhetoric and the crazy. So let's go back to a happy center,
Mm-hmm.
rather than people are tired of the crazy overt racism and lost cause message, and let's get away from that. That's not reporting I've seen, at least in the kind of the center mainstream.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think we need to be talking about that more, as here's the issue, whether you think one way or the other, but it's, let's get away from the crazy pants method of doing government by the seat of our pants, rather than let's get away from the crazy fringe of relitigating and rehashing a war that got lost.
Right. 150 years ago. Yeah.
Although it was interesting to me too, in that lost cause, they mentioned, yes, we lost the war and we lost slavery, but we haven't lost anything else. We're still here. And we can still fight. And it's interesting to me to see that kind of we're still here kind of philosophy, because it's now there's a Welsh nationalist movement afoot, that the Welsh are trying to assert some independence from the UK and from London, and that literally that's their phrase, is Ima o Hyd, we're still here. And have been since the very beginning. So but there it's done in the small people of the countryside fighting against kind of the movement of the big city, rather than a more overt racist, let's save segregation, or let's save slavery, or go back to slavery, which, having grown up in the South, I know there are still people who think, yeah, we should go back to slavery, which scares the holy hell out of me. Like, really?
Yeah. Well, and it's, I kind of got the impression, based, in some of those passages that you're talking about, Chris, I got the impression that Cruz's position is really that nobody that he's talking about has an actual real position, based on, strongly held, moral or personal philosophy at all, right? That because the implication, the way that I read that passage about Johnson was, yeah, he was a blatant racist until he decided that he wanted to be, he wanted to participate in national politics, and then he changed his tune, which is, which is one way, I mean, which is a possibility, right? And is one way of kind of looking at Lyndon Johnson's career. But another way might be, that he's a poor Texan, and he has all of the, kind of cultural baggage of a poor Texan when he enters politics, and then over time his understanding of the world and his perspective expands and shifts. I don't think, I think it's not clear to me that he had, the Kennedy Civil Rights Bill was much weaker than, and Kennedy wasn't pushing it hard, and it wasn't making progress, right? So that whole idea of, of all the polls are saying that, we'd like civil rights to go slower. Well, that was what was happening under Kennedy. And Johnson kind of grabbed it and ran with it and improved it and pushed it through, much more completely from our perspective, and much more quickly than it might otherwise have been. And it seemed to me that that was not necessary politically. That was a choice that he made, and that and probably with a fairly clear understanding that there might be negative political consequences, which is always kind of an indication to me, if somebody's doing something, I guess maybe they could be getting bad advice, and they could be expecting, that it'll have, more positive than negative consequences, but it does seem like that is that's my, and the idea that, that Nixon, Cruz seemed to be saying that Nixon, was probably pretty racist and just didn't want to say it out loud explicitly. And then later on he talks about, sort of Reagan, who begins as kind of a New Deal Democrat and shifts as he, finds a national stage. The other thing about Nixon, of course, that Cruz doesn't mention here is, Nixon is, hugely involved in, the Red Scare and in HUAC, right? And he's kind of Joseph McCarthy's right-hand man for a while. So how that might line up with, his ideas on race is an interesting question too. The one thing that jumped out at me as kind of being interesting, and maybe causing me to reassess, is that Nelson Rockefeller does seem to be kind of genuinely interested in kind of pushing this agenda forward, as he's depicted by Cruz, at least, which did kind of cause me to want to kind of relook at him a little bit as well. But do people think that they're, that nobody, first of all, do you think that that's what Cruz is implying? And then, what do you think about that idea, that maybe none of these people really do have a real, kind of strongly held belief, and they're just kind of blowing in the political winds?
Well, to me, at least, it tracks with, and it's a question of leadership. None of them go out and, or at least in Johnson's particular thing. It's, hey, the winds are blowing this way and I can take control and have power. And I still have yet to finish the 8 billion words that Robert Caro wrote on him, which I think probably it takes a while to, go through those. And if you ever do it, I recommend the audiobook first and then the fine-tooth comb the second time through. But that kind of, there is a sense, or I get a sense in American politics, that a lot of our leaders are not really tied to what they're saying. And it's, I'm going to blow this way because that's where the crowd seems to go. And it goes to the nth degree, because Trump will float half a dozen balloons
in the same speech.
and when the crowd goes one way, he shifts, and that's the way, because he wants the applause and the clap and the adulation. So he doesn't seem to have his own clear viewpoint, and shifts with whatever the winds will get him.
It does seem very much like a stand-up set sometimes.
And it's similar on huge swaths of the Republican Party. I make notes of just blatant hypocrisy. We say one thing for the leadership, and here's where we're going, but in our personal lives, we do other things. And generally it's because their feet aren't held to the fire. So you can watch, and most of the senior Republican leadership realize that they can take their daughter out of state or out of the country and get an abortion somewhere if they need it, and they'll hush it up or keep it quiet. Right. And they won't be held to the fire, because, or they'll say, hey, this is the Christian thing to do, up until the point where supporting and helping out the poor or the homeless or the hungry, Jesus really had, the golden rule was like the one thing that he had coming out of Judaism. Yeah. That he's like, we can leave all these other laws and boil it down into kind of two things. And these are the two laws we really need to do. And somehow all these, Christian Republican leaders, they talk the talk, but almost none of them seem to walk the walk.
Right. Yeah. It did. I think it was Cruz. The thing that did strike me as believable or as credible was this idea of the parties sort of looking at, especially in presidential elections, in national contests, kind of looking at regionally, can we the time when they're the part where they're accused of abandoning the Northeast to pursue the Southern strategy, and they they backfill that and say no, we still love the Northeast. But that whole idea of kind of picking these, trying to create, a winning election strategy by appealing, by finding something that they can use as leverage or use to appeal to each of these groups. That did strike me as kind of possible, and as the way that these things are, and maybe it's. I would certainly be less resistant to that whole idea that nobody really believes anything in more recent election cycles, but maybe the point is that. That really just goes back much farther.
But your election math has had effectively complete blue outs and white and red outs, isn't it? I mean, Wasn't Reagan down as being 49 states or something, or was it all 50?
Well, Nixon too. I mean, Cruz talks about Nixon winning, being the first person to win the entire South. Nixon won in 72. He won 49 states. Only Massachusetts didn't. Only Massachusetts went for McGovern, and I remember that because we had those bumper stickers that said "Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts," so it's not only the Southern strategy. So Cruz is maybe exaggerating a little bit to say that it's the Southern strategy that really did it for Reagan. I mean, not for Reagan, for Nixon. I mean, Watergate is just so bizarre in a lot of ways. I mean, just the fact that it happened, the fact that there was a cover up, but the fact that it was so unnecessary. Nixon crushed in that election. There was no stopping him. So why did he need to do that?
Yeah. Well, but presumably Massachusetts, because it's effectively Kennedy home, therefore effectively blue all the time, but not now.
But it's weird. I mean, but it was always weird because it also in what was it 68? We had a black Republican senator, right? And so Massachusetts has always been kind of weird, at least in the.
Of course, it is a Commonwealth, right? As opposed to being a mere country.
It is. It calls itself a Commonwealth. Yes. I'm not sure what possible difference that could make, but but they do. That is a word they use. Yeah.
I mean, I'm deliberately looking from the outside, and I, as much as I might follow a few bits of fictional good presidents and fictional radio TV shows for newsroom and get Daniels' speech.
Yep.
I don't follow it that closely, but it does seem that your electoral math crucifies any third party, but also crucifies likely the second party at any one moment if somebody close stands up, like Ross Perot and his People's Party or whatever it was momentarily.
Yep. There are rumors that Jesse Ventura might run for president.
Yeah.
He did get to be governor of Minnesota on that People's Party.
Yeah, but of course we don't elect our head of state. But I mean the complete blowout by Blair was big news after 20 odd years of Tories with Maggie and then John Major. But a similar number of seat type gains by Boris Johnson was huge. But of course, they were already in at that time as opposed to it being a change. So it never really became quite the same thing. I mean, you didn't get the equivalent of Blair's babes or the sheer number of change of seats and all the rest of it. And then, of course, much of it went back the next election along. And, of course, we don't have a fixed term enshrined in quite the same way as you do. We still have, although Blair tried to change that, there's still mechanisms to have one not in the 5-year sequence. And we don't have midterms, but we obviously have lots of by-elections,
right?
For death, corruption, marriage, and birth type thing. But
has a prime minister served more than 8 years in recent memory, though?
Yeah, I mean Maggie was
okay.
More than that. Blair obviously chose to do. I think from memory he was 3 3 elections.
Mm.
But don't forget, prior to Blair, there was no permanent fixed idea. So Wilson did 2 separate plots. There was Conservative in the middle,
Mm-hmm.
and then both Maggie and Major did quite a few elections because they chose to ride a wave at that moment and or prove to their own party, or Major particularly, kept on having all these traitors trying to push him out.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was like, okay, if you're going to push me out, I'm going to throw an election because it's his choice.
Right.
At which point they all panic and side back with the party, i.e. the leader at the time, because you can't, it's difficult to throw him out weeks before the election.
Yeah.
But you do get odd instances. And then, of course, Blair, there was supposedly, may or may not really be proven yet, but there was the agreement with Brown that he could have a term. So, but that's a party change and doesn't necessarily involve the entire electorate, which is always a problem. And that's the big problem of how Johnson got in for his turn, inverted commas, as leader, is that party membership is pretty small. And of course, the rules and regulations for how those parties run are all up to the party. There isn't a national set type issue. And it's like 1% of the people put Johnson in.
Yeah.
Because party change doesn't need a party leadership change doesn't automatically trigger a general election.
Yeah.
So, but in other terms, with all this, and particularly bringing in the third, the right to protest or the good protest, we of course have got elements of the same thing going on relatively now, albeit from a environmental point of view, where the various environmental groups are getting nicked at their various protests, and yet it's a complete toss-up as to whether you get convicted and not just convicted but sentenced to a custodial sentence, irrespective of how much physical damage you may have done to somebody's oil office or set of trains or a set of aeroplanes or whatever it happens to be, or you've just sat across a road, closed the motorway for an hour or something.
Right. And
that's now beginning to cause semi-international problems because the UN has said it's getting closer to having ecocide, a real genocide type ruling, at which point, in theory, those, particularly for Brexit, are going to end up with, we want our borders back. Another excuse for not following international law. And yet, of course, the bulk of the international law they originally objected to, i.e. the European human rights thing, was a British written piece of law that we as Brits wrote based on our unwritten constitution, as though it's the most British thing about the EU. And yet that then became the falsehood that really kicked off big elements of Brexit. So it's a really oddball situation. Plus, what's also happened just recently is this week, the London police, the Metropolitan Police, have put their hands up and said, oh shit, we're employing criminals. There's like something in excess of 200 officers who have recent and ongoing criminal convictions for, in many instances, for crimes that they are physically working on, as in wife abuse, assault, battery, theft, etc. That they're finally getting through to saying, "Come on, mate, it's about time you had yet another clean out." And there's a newish, it's been there about 8 or 9 months. There's a newer commissioner for the Met, and there's a couple of people I know that are actually writing to the commissioner and various other officers within the Met, saying, "You see that person over there? They are party to a conspiracy to commit murder by supporting things like oil companies to carry on having new oil fields, etc." And then being told, "But there's no evidence," or "we don't currently have a crime as I killed you by selling oil," because there's no connection. And now, of course, all those connections are coming through. And so those friends have reissued a lot of those complaints. And the current Met commissioner has said, "Yeah, okay, I'll look at it," but no movement. And yes, I agree. There will be many other police forces saying, "Hold my beer, hold my wine, or hold my vodka," just as easily, depending on your national type of drink. So, interesting times.
Yeah.
So at the moment, for instance, one of the more prominent scientists who got charged, convicted, and has been given probation only, if I recall, with a hangover fine if you do anything naughty again, seems to be planning on doing something naughty again quite soon. And it's a case of, okay, how well is his GoFundMe type request? Who wants to contribute for my defence fund? And there's obviously elements of EU law, what's left, the other bit of the EU without us, law changing, such that it might be a good tactic, and it's being discussed as to, well, maybe he should just pop over to France, Germany, Ireland, and do the similar protest, because in theory it's not a crime over there, because under EU regulations which are changing subtly, etc., and clearly will change faster, better, maybe, depending. But we will see. But ecocide's getting closer and closer and closer to being truly international law, of which the one that really makes me laugh is you guys are on the side of ecocide being made international law, but through the ICC, which of course North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Russia are non-signatories to accept their judgment. Yet you're now pushing for it to be an environmental element, which is good fun, I suppose. So,
well,
as I say, sort of interesting.
No, we don't claim to, we don't even pretend to claim to be consistent on issues like that. I mean, we don't even know where The Hague is. So don't,
No, last I heard from you guys, somewhere in Alberta.
But what about this? I was looking at the last section of that middle chapter that we read, and it did strike me as a bit problematic that Ronald Reagan, we were talking about sort of Nixon not, trying to kind of walk the knife edge, and maybe signal in some ways to Southerners, but Reagan accepting Lott's invitation to come to Philadelphia, Mississippi, and his first major event after being nominated in 1980, he goes there, right, and he talks about and he says, "I believe in states' rights." So that does seem to be that seems to be a much more kind of Barry Goldwater move, and I think Cruz is kind of right in calling that out. But jumping on to the white backlash thing, the idea that I thought that this guy Lawrence Glickman made a good point about the backlashes being kind of in a lot of cases front lashes, and that this that it's hard to say that you're looking at a backlash to Black Power when the backlash has been going on for 3 years and Black Power has only been a term for a couple of months. It did strike me also that was a good kind of inciting incident to the whole CBS Reports, I guess, is probably the predecessor to 60 Minutes, right? Black Power, white backlash. I'm going to go back and look at that. I'm sure I can find that on YouTube and see what it is that they were pushing out there. But yeah, this idea that and he quotes on the second page, at least in the format that I'm looking at it now, he quotes Lawrence Goodwin as saying that the masses don't rebel in instinctive response to hard times and exploitation because they've been culturally organized by their societies not to rebel, which I thought was kind of interesting. So the whole question of kind of agency and responsibility. He at some point he talks about three elements: agency, responsibility, and I don't remember what the third one is.
Causation.
Thank you. Causation. Oh, right. And that was Carr or somebody talking about what is history, right? Yeah. So that was, and he tied it directly to, the present, to Joe Biden and the COVID relief package and all that. What do you think about that connection? This is what happens when I'm gone for a week.
Even before getting to that too, there's the one time Republicans generally have pushed through gun legislation was at literally the beginning of that Black Power movement in California when
the Panthers had guns.
Panthers show up at the state house and with guns.
Yep.
Or we're going to watch the police kind of thing. And then it's like, oh, yeah, okay, now we need to get rid of the guns because the people we don't want to have them have them. And that's not a good thing.
Yeah.
And some of it, too, I think, is the whites in power find it much easier to punch down, to have that kind of, front lash, which I think ought to be a word.
Yeah.
Or a more common word than even the backlash part. But that I find super interesting.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
it's
the front
in
lash.
a
I
lot
mean,
of
because
different.
the front lash is interesting because it's kind of like preemptive. It's kind of like you know what's going to happen, and you're kind of preparing for it.
Well, and throughout even the small histories that we've gone through up to now, you have these groups that have, you've got the big group like the KKK that's shown up and is organized and self-organized in a physical group, or the women fundraising money to put these statues up.
Mm-hmm.
They have pre-existing organizations set up to do this.
Right.
And leading from the 50s into the 60s, African American communities hadn't been doing, they'd started the groundwork for organizing with, things like small little boycotts along the way,
Mm-hmm.
so that when it turns out that Rosa Parks, gets in trouble, they've done some organizing before that, in
Right.
years before that, that allows them to kind of leverage that organization to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And they've created some of those social structures and social connections to kind of get the word out and get people to show up to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Versus the whites on the other side who's been doing that since the war ended.
Right.
In fact, I would be willing to bet they probably had started doing it even before the war ended, in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
There had to have been at least a few people see the writing on the wall and where do we go from here? Or
Yeah.
where are we going to go from here?
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, I think it. Yeah, that whole sort of social organization that leads to, that leads to the first Klan, and then kind of comes back in the second Klan, and I think it is something that. Yeah, these kinds of informal movement, and probably also existed in black resistance during slavery, right? And so I think there's that is something that that probably historians should look at a lot more directly, is that,
Well,
and I think some have.
I remember hearing at some point too, there's the famous photograph of, I believe it was from Alabama, with the police officer holding like a German Shepherd or a Doberman Pinscher like at bay, and looks like it's attacking a young black man in the street.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, here's this like war scene, and you couldn't have staged it better.
Right.
But you've got this photo, but apparently the story after the fact came out, or recently came out, that the officer was actually trying to hold the dog back so that it wouldn't bite the kid, rather than using it as a tool or a weapon to get the kid to, sit down and run away. Although obviously that's why he was there in the first place.
That's why that's the presence of the cop and the dog. Right. Yeah.
But that photo then becomes a big, huge kind of pivotal turning point of like,
right,
who the hell are we and why are we doing this?
Right. Right. Well, and so much of that, I mean, yeah, I mean, the violence on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, kind of as they're marching to Montgomery, right, is it breaks into, I mean, all of America is sitting down to watch Judgment at Nuremberg, right, on network TV, primetime network TV, right? And so they're watching Judgment at Nuremberg. They're watching, the civilized world, so called, trying these Nazi criminals, and special report breaks in with video of this violence on the bridge, and and people having dogs set on them, and having fire hoses set on them and stuff like that. so I think that I think that has a big effect. This yeah this whole the whole sort of blaming the victim for black, how dare black people say black power, right? How dare the Panthers say they're going to, if the cops are not going to protect their neighborhoods, they're going to protect their neighborhoods with guns. That's whenever anybody uses, it's kind of weird because I don't know if it was Cruz or if it was this last chapter. Whenever anybody uses the term extra legal, that always kind of, that always kind of that gets to me because like it's not extra legal, it's illegal. Lynching is not extra legal.
Yeah. Well, it's how we use the words we choose to use to explain the things or to try and provide some justification for them.
Yeah. Well, because and that's the thing is, how can humans in a country that considers itself civilized, do this to other, humans who are supposed to be their fellow citizens.
The backlash bit, right at the end of that backlash bit, there's talk of some, if I remember rightly, without rereading it all, some journalists or group of journalists have accused various members of the black leadership of creating that backlash by doing protests in particularly white areas. I mean, the UK equivalent of that is Protestants demanding the right to do their Orange Day marches,
right?
Particularly in Derry or Londonderry, depending on which side of the political divide you're through Catholic areas,
right?
And it's like you insist on holding up, and in some respects, there's a great similarity there with statues and murals for one side or the other.
Right.
And
right. Or those tiki torch marches where they're chanting, "You will not replace us." And the ACLU, I think was right to make the point that that under our First Amendment they have to be allowed to do that, but that doesn't mean that anybody should approve of them doing that, right? And so that gets to that kind of gets to that question of what should the government do, and then what should people do. And we too often sort of default to fighting over that question of the government response because the people don't want to take any type of responsibility for reacting to a situation like that in Ferguson or anything.
Well, that's the other thing too, is the amount of effort it takes. How bad do things have to get before people will actually kind of pick up and show up to push a particular agenda or to protest? The bar seems to have gotten a lot higher because we're, and maybe that's my Gen X perspective, we're all a lot more apathetic. Or we've become so subspecialized in our areas of expertise
and outrage.
It's easy to be outraged at some perceived slight, and even more so when you don't know any of this kind of deeper, interesting history.
Yeah.
And you don't see the nuance, but where we're also working in essentially I think about it a lot now because the Fed and interest rates and inflation is an issue, but the Fed really has one switch they can flick. It's either interest rates up or interest rates down.
Right.
And the presumption is that one switch is going to fix all that ails us from an economic perspective. And it's way more complicated than that. And we have a whole lot of other levers we can switch and pull and dials we can turn, but our politics and the people who control those are far away and have way more problems than the 13 Fed banks that can kind of all at least come together and say, hey, let's turn the switch on or let's turn the switch off, which is an easy decision for 13 people to come up with. But then when you look at the broader political picture, generally we have two switches we can choose as an electorate. We can either flick the Democrat switch or the Republican switch.
Yeah.
And it's not, you don't have a whole lot of, which is why all these wedge issues become a thing, is it's how do we as a party try and create a basket of goods that will get you to push the switch this way or that way, rather than, hey, let's vote on a broader range of, maybe every 100 years we need to have a special election that breaks topics down into smaller pieces that we can vote in a particular direction on them.
Yeah.
Some kind of broader referenda. And then in the off years, the off century, we go back to, less, the federalism system. So I think the majority of America thinks that abortion generally is okay and it's fine, but somehow we've gotten ourselves into a situation where a minority is now dictating, what kind of health care you can get. And it's not just that, but it's like 50 other issues have that same thing.
Right.
And if you run for president, it's generally the case that you may have 50 things you want to get done, but you'll be lucky if you can get 2 or 3. Like if you're Obama and you can get healthcare through in your first section, like the winds are going to change before, item 2 on your list could get taken care of. And or you may need every bit of political capital you've got just to get the first thing done. And then you're treading water for 6 years thereafter.
Right. Well, and even is there, can we create a forum in which we can actually have conversations about these things?
UK wise, there's been, can't remember exactly what they call them, but there is a relatively random selection of, say, 100 normal people, in inverted commas, that come together for one issue. They then chew it over in relative private and come up with a set of recommendations. People something they call them. I can't remember exactly what they're called now. And there's been a couple, and they've been making various recommendations. But it's the same as with more recent stuff with the likes of Johnson. He's gone out and organised supposed independent reports on various aspects. The report comes in, and then he just puts it in a drawer and leaves it. So we never get it. Like for the UK last election, what influence there was from any Russian external influence, etc. And it's like, yeah, okay, but I then go back and think of who's got a big history of it, and it's like, you guys, So what was the more recent influence stroke activist work into the last 10 plus elections that was US centric? Yes, okay, we can blame the Russians or blame the Soviets, but you guys have got, along with us as well, of course, interfering in normal democratic elections.
We're
allies.
we wrote the
Italy
book.
Come to mind when they're NATO allies.
Right.
Never mind Chile or anywhere down south.
Iran or Honduras or Guatemala or Cuba.
Yeah.
Well, and that's the and one of the actually the reason I asked is there a forum where we can discuss that is because I heard some news this week that Twitter has begun to ban Substack links. And I don't think that my links to my Substack posts have been banned. I think they're focusing on people who are actually, writing.
Well, the one on that I heard was that they want to keep Twitter inside Twitter, and they're lowering the scores for anything with an external reference.
Yeah, well,
So whether,
and I think that
Substack or Facebook, it didn't seem to matter.
Right. And I think that is, and I heard that sort of, and that actually kind of produced some backlash, right? Like, like news, people who actually do news on Substack, like Matt Taibbi, have basically said, well, I'm going to use Substack Notes. And I think it was triggered by Substack saying that they're going to have this notes thing that's going to be sort of a Twitter analog. But simultaneously, I was at this open textbook conference this week, and the day two keynote was Brian Alexander, and he's kind of a professional futurist, and he he gave a kind of a generic talk, really, about the future for higher ed. And he's written several books about, the future for academia. The most recent one is about the climate crisis. And but it came up, in the course of discussions around his keynote that that Chat GPT is, and Bing and Bard and all these other things that are kind of coming along. These language models are being blocked by organizations like Facebook and probably Twitter will be right behind, and and that people are saying, no, you can't come and scrape, you can't basically come and scrape all of our user data into your language model and use it as the basis of this chat bot or whatever it is, this AI app, and that's going to create, I think that's going to create yet again a bunch. I mean, that's really going to demonstrate the effect of filter bubbles. That people are going to have their own sets of facts that these models, and to whatever extent these language models are going to, the way that Chat GPT does now, are going to give you an answer rather than give you search results, right? I mean, if you go to Google and you ask it a question, it'll give you, page after page after page of possible results that you can sift through yourself and decide, which one you want to use, which one has credibility to you. But
it depends on the question.
But if you ask the same question of Chat GPT, it's not going to do that. It's going to give you, kind of the equivalent of a 5-paragraph essay if you choose that format, or or something. So it's going to give you an answer that basically has already sort of sifted through everything out there, and this is the thing that it has decided is, I mean, it to a great extent, it's regression to the mean again, right? I've probably said this before. I've been thinking about this for the last couple of weeks. So it's not going to take a far out, kind of a position. Is going to take the median of all of these all of the potential answers. And so we're gonna have, once again, kind of a consensus thing, except if we have all of these different silos of data sets that people are training their own language models on, right? So if Google decides that I'm going to have I'm going to have a language model now, and they're talking about putting Bard up in the in the top right of every Google search and making that an option, or if Facebook has theirs based on their data, and Twitter has theirs based on their data, and Wikipedia has theirs, and then some of these other data.
But as far as scraping data,
yep.
the likes of Facebook and Google particularly, and I'm not so sure about Twitter not being a significant user and not there anymore anyway. That's a bit of a pot calling the kettle black element about you can't scrape ours. I mean, there is only, I think there used to be a switch in Facebook that says, can I turn on or off the ability of Google search to see my Facebook pages or Facebook posts? I don't know whether that's still there or active still.
Well, you can put robots. You can put a robots.txt, kind of a.
But if you go back to 2 or 3 meetings ago when Mark Grape was still about, if you ask don't ask it for a set of lyrics, because if you ask for a set of lyrics out of Google, it won't give you a set of lyrics, it'll find a set of lyrics. Whereas ChatGPT will create a set of lyrics. But as I said back then, I see ChatGPT and what I've been using it for as a barefaced liar. Please find me the top 10 papers for XYZ. It comes back and I look at all 10 and at least 2 of them don't exist. Whereas I don't think I ever get that from Google Scholar, but I have to be much more unchatty. I have to be much more code-like in some respects when I ask that same question of Google Scholar. So they're definitely not equivalent tools, but I can see people making them. I mean, Pat mentioned it, I think, a while back about it would be interesting to see what would happen individually if we dumped ChatGPT into our hard drive or into our sort of cloud savings and say, learn that. And yeah, I mean, I would love to be able to say, drop it into my collection and say, from my collection, give me the top 10 repetitive results. And as I say, there's a heap of stuff on this laptop. Never mind what's on cloud, but and it would be interesting almost to do the same question to the open chat GBT that's outside, recognizing, of course, there's been a major change for I think version 3 to version 4. Version 4 now can see outside, whereas version 3 was restricted to what it knew about up to September 2021.
Right.
So that's a useful change to an extent, but you then have to be careful, more so, I suppose, in terms of asking it as to what you want, how you want it, and all the rest of it.
Well, I mean, the upshot of knowing about what's happened in 2020 and 21 and 22 might be, that it takes a stand on COVID based on, on the number of times that things, that misinformation has been repeated, that may not have anything to do with objective reality.
And seeing as I noticed Scotland being mentioned, there's obviously a big, this week again, political hoo-ha with when the First Minister resigned, saying she was tired and couldn't carry on. And that was like 4 weeks ago or so. And it now turns out that her husband has been investigated for misuse of party funds.
Oh, that's very tiring.
Except at the moment, I haven't seen anything as to was it really misuse, or was it just a use
Or was it
for
a Clarence,
good purposes?
Clarence Thomas style misuse?
Yeah. So it seems to be up in the air, and if so, either way, did she know or not know?
Yeah.
Because they're now looking at it as being, will this crush the SNP, who were, as of last week, prior to the announcement, only 1 or 2 votes short
Yeah.
of being able to vote their guy in again. And now, of course, we've got this real quirky thing in the UK. We have a ethnic Pakistani Muslim having to ask an ethnic Indian Hindu, can I please leave the UK via a vote? Because the First Minister for Scotland is now a Pakistani Muslim, and the Prime Minister of the UK is an Indian Hindu. So it's
all down to Lord Mountbatten and the partition again.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the answer to that is we just get a Sri Lankan to toss a coin, really.
Right. There you go. Wow.
A Buddhist Sri Lankan.
Yeah, or right, or a Sikh.
There's plenty of them still.
Yep.
So I think the while we don't have colour segregation in terms of reality and all the rest, we do have the Northern Ireland issue, of course, coming back to that, the segregation in terms of areas to live between the Protestant versus a Catholic.
Yeah. What has happened there? I mean, I remember there being a lot of Tim. I remember there being a lot of anxiety around the settlement of Brexit, that the new border between EU Ireland and British Northern Ireland was going to cause problems. Have there been problems, or was that
There is. There's supposedly a current solution which is working its way through, but it is still a flip-flop that puts Northern Ireland back into the EU for trade, so the border doesn't exist.
Oh, okay.
But the problem then comes, of course, is Northern Ireland gets half plus of its normal stuff from the rest of the UK. So at what point do we reinstate the border controls that are causing problems on the south coast, with queues and lorries being perishable, rotting away and all that palaver?
Yeah.
Although, oddly enough, 2 different friends have gone over to Europe this weekend for the long weekend, the Easter holiday, which is a common thing. Both at about the same time, and one was in a car and showed all of the ferry roadway where you normally have thousands of cars queuing for the next ferry, and then it's probably 3 ferries worth of cars visible, and there were 2 cars, so normally you'd see like 2,000.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other person who was going on as a passenger, there is now obviously a proper passport control building where you have to go show your passport, etc. And that was heaving on about the same day, at about the same time. So, who knows what is the real truth?
Right. So, is there a class? Is there a class component of that change?
No, because having a car in the UK is that's context, and taking a car up is not a big difference cost. You tend not to pay for the car, you tend to pay for the number of passengers.
Oh, okay.
So if you go on your own, it could be expensive. But if you go with the family, which is a normal thing you do for holidays, it wouldn't be so expensive. What's probably still cheaper is to get the train. So you get the Channel Tunnel train. It's certainly cheaper than flying.
Well,
But depending on where you are relative to the railway system, it's quicker still. But yeah, been a while since I've caught the ferry. I mean, I was 10 when I first caught the ferry, and thinking about it, I was 20, 21 since I last caught the last one. That was still a few years ago. I thought since then, every time I've gone from the UK via sort of the Kentish ports anyway, I've caught a plane. But since I moved out of London, because it's a pain in the arse. If you're like I was out at Bath, Bristol area, it's a pain in the arse to get to Dover, a tight space. So I was always catching the hydrofoil, which is a much quicker, much more stable boat, out from Poole Harbour to San Marlo. And I took the car most of the time, not every time, but most of the time. And those have been more recent, and with the kids. So that's much more recent. But in terms of going via Kent, I haven't been since I was like 22, 21, 22. But and that's where like 9/10 of the road come walk-on traffic goes through. But the segregation element, while it might be whole streets commonly, there are instances where the left-hand side is one and the right-hand side is another as well. Plus, there are mixed streets. It's just you don't talk to the other type of people. But I can't tell, because they're both white. You can't tell the difference at a distance unless they're wearing some sort of insignia or colour, or they're walking out of a particular church type thing. Or businesses, because obviously a lot of the time you don't go to a other business, etc., for your shopping or for your whatever. But I've only been to Republic, because that's where the in-laws came from. So, which was always good fun at Ramadan at Christmas, but never mind. The only other thing I've got on this element of the white backlash type stuff is from the reading, which I don't really think I'd seen much of it before, in terms of being talked about or illustrated in the sense of what this chapter shows. But it clearly something other people have thought about, in terms of you've been trying to minimize with various amendments and stuff, and yet haven't seemingly solved the problem. And I think in some respects is not some of the solution to disconnect this seemingly odd economic stupidity that you have, which we've spoken about 2 or 3 sessions ago in some respects, along with the poverty book and Piketty as well, about the apparent unusual, I'm a poor rural person, white, but my party of choice tells me it's their fault, rather than it's, I'm voting Republican yet again, but the Republicans don't really do anything for the white rural poor. So if you can break that, how much of a solution could it be?
Well, yeah,
Or a big part solution. It won't necessarily be at all, that's for sure.
Mhm. Well, I think that's a good question. How much of it, how much of this is, again, just political rhetoric that that makes it easier to polarize people. Not I won't say that it doesn't have an an important and significant effect on a lot of people, but is chosen because it's polarizing rather than because somebody is wanting to actually make changes that are going to be significant in people's lives. I think that there's there's a lot of I'm sorry, go ahead, Judy.
Front lashing again.
Yeah, but and also identity politics, right? And hitting people's hot buttons in ways that are not that aren't about actually having a nuanced kind of conversation about the issue and moving forward in some way, but just getting people to sort of rally around their team colors.
Too much of it is about the fear, uncertainty, and doubt on whatever an issue is. And most of the time when we're talking about issues, one side is trying to scare you to death, while the other side is just talking about the basics, whether it's one side or the other.
Yeah.
And
it's kind of interesting and ironic in a way. I mean, that first chapter, kind of begins with the PragerU reference, and I've always had this thing about sort of Prager or Foundation for Economic Education or Mises or some of these some of these kind of public facing propagandistic kind of think tanks that that somebody should do something about that. Somebody should react. Somebody should do a response video. And set them straight. And it's it's very time consuming, and there's a lot of
it's like you're the think tank, do the thinking and give us what the response should be, like where should we be going and why, and they don't do that. It's my favorite this week is after the Democrats have voted with Republicans to extend the debt ceiling dozens of times throughout the Trump administration, suddenly the Republicans are saying, hey, we're not going to do this. We want to hold you hostage on X, Y, and Z and not extend the debt ceiling. And Biden has put forth a proposal for what he wants to do. And the Republicans are just saying, oh, no, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Yet they have not put forward any kind of proposal of any sort whatsoever. Like,
right,
if we don't do this, let's do these other things instead.
Right.
But instead of putting forward something you can work against, they're just putting forward the fear and oh, things are going to come collapsing down.
Right.
And but there's no thought behind it. So it's like, and to me, that is super disingenuous.
Right. Well, and there's no actual position behind it. Again, it's just what you do when you're the opposition party. So so I mean,
and if you're opposing it, what is it exactly you're opposing, and what should we be doing instead? And the opposition party should always have, and maybe that's this part of this discussion we've been having about the politicians kind of blowing in the wind. Which way are we? I'm their leader. Which way did they go?
Well, I think it was, and I think that whole unwillingness of the Southern conservative Democrats to actually change party and lose their perks was the tell, right? That that this is not about that the only reason that we have two parties is the same reason we have two teams in a football game, right? So that we can have a contest, and the contest is for its own sake. And and the people are in it for the personal power, and the pork for their district, perhaps. I mean, even that would be I think is probably sometimes too much to actually believe that they're doing.
So are you saying, to sum you up, Dan, are you saying don't hate the player, hate the game?
Yeah. Well, I'm saying hate the player too, because all these people have gotten into the game knowing what it is. So but it's sort of I mean, maybe I am saying that because it's sort of like the whole disappointment with all these people that we put that we hold out hope for, that this person is going to come in and change. The squad is going to come in and okay, thanks, John. See ya. That that the squad's going to come in and is going to take a stand, right? And then they find out that, oh, holy shit, if I get 2 terms, then I get a pension for life. And how am I going to get 2 terms unless I play? So yeah, it's a huge golden handcuff. And and it's I think that's really unfortunate. That there aren't any.
I'm glad we have billionaire leaders like Trump who aren't in it for the money.
Yeah, or Elon. Yeah. Elon just wants to make the world free for speech, but only if it's on his platform. And if you link out to a competing platform, then screw you. That was kind of disappointing.
To me, if the thing was the Sheena Ibu dog, like you literally made the website look worse.
The Doge dog, yeah. Is that gone? I usually use it. I didn't notice that the change had happened on. Let me see. No, it's gone back. Yeah, it's gone back to the bird. Apparently, he promised that he would change the logo to the Doge dog. So he was paying off his base.
The market for that blew up when he did it.
Yeah. Yep.
I don't know. I'm happier over at Mastodon for a while.
Yeah, I'm gonna probably try Notes and see if it works.
Well, that's the other problem too, though, is there, even as as its own platform, Substack has a kind of problematic history with the voices they choose to promote and enable, which is a whole nother, I would be a little more prone. I come from an indie web background, so I prefer to have all of the stuff on my own domain and control it so that others can't pull the rug out from underneath me.
Right.
But you also need some of these kind of algorithmic reach things that places like Substack or Twitter or whatever it is provide you with.
Yeah.
Because not everybody is kind of on the free and open interwebs,
right,
to kind of find and do that type of thing.
Yeah. I used to get fair traffic on my own websites, that I owned the domains and hosted them myself. I suspect that would be different now. I suspect that my traffic would be a whole lot less. Well, it looks like it's time for us to go. So for next week, I think what we have agreed on is the good protest, which we skipped, and then the Great Society and the family values feminism, which is, I think, about Phyllis Schlafly, but we'll see where it goes. I don't know. And then that'll leave us 4 things to do the following week. So I think
I don't remember the name of it, but there was a good like 3 or 4 part TV series a year or 2 ago that looked at like 70s left and right, Phyllis Schlafly and the feminist movement.
They
But
called
I
it
can't
like the
remember for the life.
70s.
Yeah, it was something, and I had some
The
really good
decade.
actors in it.
Hmm.
But I'm curious to read, and I haven't read any like serious history on it since I saw that show, which is more about the entertainment value, I think, than it was the
right.
direct history. So
Right. Okay, and I will. I didn't because I was out out of town for a couple of days. I did not get things all situated and squared away. So I'll post both of the videos and both of the chat transcripts later on today.
I missed the first couple minutes, but how's the new dog?
Oh, the new puppy is great. Not quite sleeping through the night yet, and but we're getting him outside, to do his business. So we haven't had any big problems with that yet. And the big dog, our old dog, has decided to be his stepmom. So that's a big relief. They're getting along.
But we're still in early puppy days, so it's still the kid's dog and not dad's dog yet.
Yeah, so far. So far, although my daughter was trying to she's trying to crate train him and get him to actually sleep in his crate, and he went ballistic at about 2 a.m. because he wanted to get out, and she wanted him to stop crying before she let him out, and so so it went on for like 25 minutes, and I had to like intervene. So yeah.
I think the over under is somewhere about a month.
Yeah,
it said it's dad's dog. So
yeah, we'll see. Yeah, it's a cute enough dog. It'll be a fun dog to have for the next 15 or 20 years or whatever. Yep.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay. Yep. See you soon.
Right.
Thanks.